friends. My name is Stephanie Romero, and I am the founder and executive director of Awaken Pittsburgh. I want to welcome you to our podcast, The Ripple Effect. Awaken Pittsburgh is a nonprofit dedicated to fostering well-being, empathy, and compassion for all by teaching and encouraging mindfulness and meditation practices. I also want to take a moment to let you know that Awaken Pittsburgh offers many other opportunities for practice and connection. For example, you can join our online community, which features a space to more deeply explore the topics we cover with our guests. We have weekly posts to spark thought, practice, and reflection. I hope you will come join us to explore, connect with others, and deepen your practice. You can find out more at awakenpittsburgh.org. On today's episode of the Ripple Effect podcast, we are so lucky to have with us retired Army SFC Dan Jarvis. Dan was deployed to a combat zone in Afghanistan in 2011. Shortly after his arrival, he stepped on a pressure plate and detonated an IED 5 feet from his position on the dismounted patrol. The IED left Dan with a traumatic brain injury. He insisted on continuing to lead his troops, but was sidelined for a week by the battalion surgeon. After weeks of no sleep as a result of that IED blast, he led his squad on a mission to escort an explosive team to defuse a bomb found by another platoon. His role in the lead vehicle as truck commander was to detect IEDs on the route and ensure safe passage for the other vehicles in the convoy. An undetected IED exploded under the fourth vehicle, taking the life of SPC Doug Cordo. Dan felt responsible for losing Doug since finding the IEDs as lead truck commander was his responsibility. Dan founded the nonprofit 220 on April 15, 2018, to stand in the gap to heal our heroes. Dan also, on the 6-year anniversary of 220, April 15, 2024, founded a new nonprofit called Healing the Hero. Healing the Hero is going to be a faith-based nonprofit deploying the Jesus Protocol to heal the root injury of PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Healing the Hero desires to partner with churches, provide training and resources, and develop trainers. This organization will be a starfish organization. If you cut a starfish in half, you get 2 complete starfish. Dan, I'm so grateful that you're joining me and excited to talk to you because honestly, the work that you do has impacted my life greatly, and I think the lives of so many people. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to share with your audience what we can do.
Awesome. So this month's topic is empathy. So I guess we could just start with what empathy means to you.
Sure. Empathy is it's critical for humans to be able to connect with one another. There's a big difference between empathy and sympathy. Empathy is your ability to relate to other people. You have to be able to have some kind of connection points with people in order to further relationships. And kind of the sphere that we work in, empathy is critical, right? Because if you lack empathy, you don't connect with people. You can't even relate to other people. Want to a little bit of you mind if I share a little bit about my backstory?
Please.
Yeah, just so your audience knows, I'm a combat veteran of the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, and I'm also a former law enforcement officer. And empathy is one of those things, specifically in the latter profession. It's critical for like law enforcement officers because you're interacting with public that are oftentimes in distress pretty regularly. So if you can't empathize with them, you're not going to give them the service that they need. And unfortunately, I think we see a lot of law enforcement will kind of get triggered quite frequently because of the nature of their work. And just so people understand, when you have a nervous system, a limbic system reaction where you trigger, you're automatically shutting off your empathy. And then that creates for a disastrous outcome. From the military perspective, I had a pretty difficult couple deployments. I was an infantry combat infantryman, so my job was an infantry squad leader. I had men that I was responsible for. In my last deployment to Afghanistan, one of my soldiers was killed. Four of my soldiers were wounded, not to come back into the fight. We had 8 Purple Hearts in a squad of about 11, including myself. So I struggled quite a lot when I came home. And you know, I stepped on a pressure plate in July of 2011, and the pressure plate detonated an IED that was probably 5 to 10 feet away from me while on a dismounted patrol. So there's no vehicle, there's no up armored, there's nothing. It's just overpressure in the human body, and it can create disastrous results with the traumatic brain injuries. And that's another factor too that a lot of people don't realize. If you end up with a frontal lobe injury, that's where your empathy centers are, which is one of the reasons why when you trigger, you shutting off that prefrontal cortex, you lose empathy. It's also people that have dementia, Parkinson's, some of these frontal lobe injuries, Alzheimer's, they tend to not have empathy, not because they choose not to, but because their brain literally shuts that part of their brain off. So when I came back from Afghanistan, I did a lot of self-medication. Right. I drank a lot of alcohol just so I could sleep. When that IED blast went off, I'd nod off to sleep after that, and I'd hear an explosion, and next thing you know, I'm up reacting to it. My nervous system is in full fight or flight. And alcohol was one of those things that shuts down that fight or flight response, but alcohol also doesn't allow you to process emotions in a healthy manner. So, for me, it got to the point after returning from Afghanistan that I was actively suicidal. I had made a plan that I was going to take my own life, because being in that sphere as a leader in the military, there's nowhere to go to ask for help, right? We want to make sure we take care of our guys, or our girls, but we don't know what to do for ourselves. So we tend to end up having bad outcomes. Because if you're triggering all the time with PTSD and you're shutting off your frontal cortex, you're also shutting off the empathy, not only for other people, but yourself, which is why somebody can pull the trigger or overdose or do whatever they want to do. So that was kind of like my journey. And I really, when I was medically retired from the Army on September 11th, 2014, all I did was trade one uniform in for another. I went from military back into law enforcement. It felt normal for quite a while, right? Because a lot of people don't understand, and this is the one of the things maybe your audience can have a little bit of empathy for law enforcement officers. They're just reacting. Their nervous system is getting conditioned regularly, like they're literally training their brain how to operate in fight or flight. Which, if they can't pull back for moments, they do shut off their empathy centers. I mean, you can see videos all over the internet of cops doing really, really stupid things just because of that lack of empathy and that frontal cortex shutdown. So understand that most of your police officers are dealing with a lot of stress on a lot of daily on the daily, right? So really, that's kind of like my little bit of my backstory. And then when I left law enforcement, everything kind of came back with a vengeance. My PTSD, depression, and the first thing that the VA wanted to do was prescribe medication, right? Here's your pills, take your meds, do this. And then it's talk therapy, and wasn't really getting anywhere with that. I mean, wasn't a whole lot of resources out there in the mainstream healthcare system that can help PTSD. I think probably one of the more well-known processes is EMDR. EMDR has been used, which comes out of neuro-linguistic programming, has been used since I think Francine Shapiro developed it in the 1980s. And that really was it. And I tried the EMDR, and I was kind of all over the place with it. I really didn't have a good outcome. And I was just really looking for alternatives. And then my ex-wife, Gwinnell, brought in a gentleman to do some leadership training at our sheriff's office where I used to work. She was an administrator there, and he's a retired Army colonel. He's a Green Beret. Invited me to do a men's leadership retreat. And then I just kind of went down a rabbit hole and a journey. I founded a nonprofit called 220. And the goal of 220 was to end the epidemic of suicide in the veteran space, because the number 22 is representative of the number of veterans who take their lives every day. Depending upon which study, some the VA's trying to say it's a little bit less, and then there are other studies that say might even be double that. So we really don't know the accurate numbers. I just know that we're losing more veterans to suicide than we are in combat. And I've lost a lot of friends to suicide, a lot of buddies that I'd worked with. Just to give you a frame of reference, the company I went to Afghanistan with, we had about 100 men in that company. We lost two in combat that deployment year, but we've lost about seven to suicide since coming home. And, the unit I went to Iraq with, we were there for 15 months. We lost 17 Americans in that deployment from a battalion of about the size of 700. And we've probably lost 20 to 25 to suicide since returning. So we're losing way more back home, and even in the first responder sphere. And I don't want to, I'll just kind of get off this topic, but we lose more first responders to suicide than line of duty deaths as well. So that journey for me was, how do we find a better way, right? How do we find a better way to heal the root injury? And then going down those rabbit holes, we found some very successful methods that we modeled that have been around for 40, 50 years, right? And some in that world of neuro-linguistic programming. And, I developed the trauma resiliency protocol as one method, which came out of what was called a phobia cure. It's a little bit different, actually a lot different than what the NLP method is, but we're using that same concept of associating and disassociating that'll allow the emotions to remove from those memories. And then the emotions management processes for like rooted negative emotions like anger, resentment, anxiety. And then now we've even developed a new process called the peer rescue protocol, which is the same method that'll work with both. And the results were just staggering. Yeah, I'm not an information guy, right? So I don't need to see the data. I'm not the kind of guy that needs to know how the cheese is made. I just need to know it tastes good. And when we started doing data capture, pre and post scoring, that was pretty profound. I was like, okay, now you've got my attention, to the point where, we're seeing massive changes in a person's emotional well-being and health. And the interesting part is, these are exercises are more like guided mindfulness, right? It isn't talk therapy. We don't let them discuss their experiences. We don't let them sit in those emotions. It's like, how do we move them through that emotional state to get them to a better emotional state? And that's really the premises behind the mindfulness. So we just guide that process. And the next thing you know, you have a very powerful outcome where you're not able to feel a traumatic stressor anymore. And if you're able to shut off those traumatic triggers, well, guess what? You have a lot more access to the decision making and the logic and the empathy that you need to be a better person. So that's kind of the backstory of the 22-0.
Yeah, I
And
appreciate you framing all of that for the listeners. And I mean, I could listen to your story every time because I find it so inspirational, particularly that, from your own struggle, from your own suicidality, from your own PTSD, you have actually given your entire life to helping others heal. And if that's not the best example of empathy, I'm not sure what is.
well, I appreciate that. It's kind of like the way I look at it. When you find your way out of darkness, it's a moral obligation to shine the light back into the others. Because how do we get people to not want to die, right? How do we get people to be able to shut down those triggers so that they can have better interpersonal reactions with the people they love the most? I'll go into a group of veterans and I'll ask, how many people in here have said something to the person they love and care about the most, and 5 minutes later were shaking their heads and couldn't believe they uttered those words? That's because in that triggered state, they've lost all empathy. So you've literally become a 90-second sociopath, and you're able to say things to people that you love the most. Once that empathy returns and that nervous system shuts back off, you're like, oh my God, I can't believe I just said that. So it's all about, how do we get people to relate better to others? How do we get people to have more empathy for others? How do we get law enforcement officers to have more empathy, or firefighters, because they're working in very stressful environments every single day. Even as when I was a cop, when I was off duty, I was on duty, right? So think about that. And that's why in those professions that there's so many illnesses, so many, you know, pick your cancer, autoimmune issues, diabetes, obesity, you know, heart disease, strokes. It's all because of that stress. There's a psychiatrist, world renowned, named Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, wrote a book, The Body Keeps Score, and there is no truer statement. That's why we get physically sick. Stress can actually cause us to get physically sick. So, which is why it's so important to do some kind of practice, whether it's mindfulness, some kind of meditation, to be able to regulate that nervous system so that we can have long-term healthy outcomes.
Yeah, so there's a couple things you have in there that I want to follow up on. Well, so many things. But the first one is I love, love, love that part of your definition of empathy is connection,
Mhm.
right? Because I really think that, and the way you describe the neurophysiology of it, that when our trauma is triggered, there is a disconnect in our own brain that doesn't allow us to make that connection with the other human being. Those mirror neurons aren't firing, right?
Right.
We can't actually feel what they feel. We only feel the overwhelm of our own trauma trigger. And so I
Exactly.
think that that's super important for people to understand. And even your example is law enforcement. As you know, we work in Awaken Pittsburgh with law enforcement and first responders, but we also work with educators. And I
Right.
would say the same thing happens in the classroom,
Mhm.
right? Teachers get triggered and then they're no longer
Absolutely.
empathetic. They're no longer empathetic. And so that, our work in the world is aligned with yours in that we're really, really trying to bring in those practices that will help people notice when that's happening, pause, work to regulate, right? Get
Yeah.
their nervous system into a regulated state so that they can serve whoever or teach whoever they're working with from that place of connection. So I appreciate that you're naming that because it's so important in any caring, helping, teaching profession.
Yeah, I'll give a little bit of anatomy of the root of a traumatic trigger. So a lot of people may not understand why all of a sudden their nervous system goes crazy. When a traumatic event occurs, and I'll use the metaphor of an engine. Your brain's like an engine, right? It idles at 1,000 RPMs, and then something happens and your foot hits the gas pedal. You're either hauling butt through it, hauling butt away from it, or the engine seizes up as it's revving at 8,000 RPMs. So everything that happened around that moment in time that was a bad memory, all the emotions glue to that memory, right? So not only the emotions, but the sounds, the smells, the images. Imagine, maybe somebody was sexually assaulted and a person was wearing Drakkar cologne, right? Next thing you know, you're smelling Drakkar cologne and the whole nervous system goes into red alert mode. They're back. Save yourself. Get out of danger. And then the limbic system activates and you go into a full on fight or flight, or what we call lizard brain, right? Your lizard brain takes over. You don't see anything except the exit. How do I get out of here? How do I fight? How do I do whatever? And then you're just not a resourceful self at that point. So the work that we do on the trauma resiliency protocol or the peer rescue protocol is teach the brain how to release that neural pathway, that amygdala response. How do we shut down the amygdala response so that the brain can process it or reprocess it in a healthy manner? And then that smell doesn't trigger you all the time. Because the reality is, we're not having to worry about saber-tooth tigers breaking twigs in the woods anymore. It's a different world. Now we still need to be safe. There's people that, but that's different. That fight or flight response will take over at any moment, whether you're awake or asleep. And imagine if it's in a nightmare and you're in your sleep and you wake up and you're sweating and your heart's racing 160 beats a minute because the brain doesn't know that it's not a real situation. It's really in that fight or flight. Just a very unhealthy way to live.
Yeah, thanks for breaking that down for folks. And I guess I'm really curious, just, people hearing your story, think to themselves like, wow, this guy went through so much and he made it out the other end, right?
Right.
And so I'm just really curious if you could share, like, what are your daily practices that you feel really sustain you and support your mental health and well-being? You've done so much healing and so much work to kind of come out the other end of that really dark place. But what's your routine now that's your mental hygiene that you think you could share with folks to help them understand what they could be doing?
Sure. I do a more of a meditative practice now. And for me, it centers around my faith. So it's prayer, right?
Right.
How do I get to a space where I can clear my thoughts, focus on something good, focus on my faith, and maybe incorporate some breath work into that to kind of calm the self and to
Mm-hmm.
just let all these other thoughts out of the way, right? How do, because we all have life stressors, whether it's a traumatic stressor or a normal stressor, we can get in our thoughts and ruminate, and then, add traumatic brain injury. And on top of that, maybe you're having racing thoughts because you have high peak alpha in your brain. You got to find ways to get out of those loop-de-loops, basically, is what they are, and kind of recenter yourself. So for me, it's faith and it's prayer. That's how my meditative practice goes too.
Yeah, and for a lot of people that we work with, we're a secular organization, but I've had so many of our participants take our program and then tell me afterwards that the practices we taught them actually deepen their practice in their faith tradition.
Good.
Right?
Yeah.
Because I feel like it is in alignment because you're working with your highest self, right? And for some people, that's a religious tradition, and for other people, it's not, which is, perfectly fine. Whatever works for you to get you to that place of connection and clarity, I think.
Awesome.
Yeah. So I'm curious around in your work, what you do with folks. And I've seen you deliver the protocols. One of the things that I'll just let folks know I am a student of Dan's. Dan has trained me. But one of the things that I've been kind of exploring and figuring out how to hold, although people don't share the content with you, right?
Right.
It's an intense experience to hold space for someone as they're
Yes.
working through their trauma.
Correct.
Right. And so I'm just curious about, like, one, what is the role of empathy there in the moment? And then what do you do to help yourself hold that difficulty?
Well, because I'm dealing with mostly vets and first responders. So I'll give you an example. I had a gentleman I worked with. He's a deputy sheriff out in California. And I had to get him as he came off work because I needed him to sleep. That's part of the process. And I knew a little bit about his story from the person who made the connection. And it was a pretty horrific event that occurred only a few weeks ago. And so I'm always concerned for their well-being because I've been there and I know it's not healthy and I know it's not safe for a lot of people to be in that space, just from my own experience. So I will do whatever I can. So for him, I woke up at 3:30 in the morning, East Coast time. He got off work at midnight. So I did the session at 3:30 in the morning just so that he could sleep. And what I do is I'm going after the entire trauma history in a single session. So we didn't start with his big event. We started with his earlier events, but I grouped them all in this. So basically what I did is I activated about, I think it was 5 traumatic events. The last one, his recent one, was a 10 on a 0 to 10 scale. It was the most intense one. And then we just attacked the whole thing. And then when he did the release, oftentimes I can see it because I have high empathy and I feel people's emotions. So that's the difficult part. It's a superpower in the fact that I know what they're feeling, but I also know when they're releasing it. But it's hard on us physically. So, and this is an exercise that your audience can use. There's 2 different methods that you can do because the brain really doesn't know the difference. You can actually trick the brain every once in a while. So if you're feeling somebody's emotions because you're high empathy, you're a high empath, there's a technique that you can do by imagining that person holding a big horseshoe magnet. And then you allow them to pull all their energy back to themselves. Or my favorite one is the hammer of Thor, Thor's hammer, the superhero, all the electricity coming off it. I'll just imagine I'm holding that Thor's hammer and I'll let all that energy come out of my body and then I'll toss that into the sun. And remarkably, it pulls the emotions out. So you have to have some method of protecting. And sometimes I don't let them see me, but I'll be doing deep breath work too. Cause I'm like, okay, I'm feeling this guy's energy. So I'm like, and I'm just pausing and I'm kind of letting it out, and of course I'll make sure my mic is muted or something if I got to do a big exhale, but I have to do those things to protect me because it is intense. And when you're holding that space, it's a massive responsibility. So I want to make sure I don't lose any rapport with that person at all. So I'm having to do these things so that I can keep myself, and then I'm all smiles when the session's over and I'm feeling great, because then you're getting the dopamine and the oxytocin, from, man, you just made a powerful connection with this person. You just made a massive change in his life, and then I have to reinforce to them, hey, look, this is the process. This isn't me, right? This isn't me coming in and saving the day. This is me teaching your brain how to save itself, because that's really all we're doing, is we're guiding your brain to do what it can do. You just don't know how to do it, so that it can get those mindful practices where you can actually get those neural pathways to let go. So
That was really beautiful, because I'm right there with you. I'm a really high empath. And so there are moments, even if you don't know the content of the trauma, where the physical manifestation of it on that person as they're recalling it feels so intense for me.
right.
It's really intense. The other thing that is intense for me is sometimes at the end of the TRP process, people just sob.
Yep.
That's happened a couple of times with folks that I'm working with, and it's a release.
It's a grief
But it's
response.
also very intense. The emotional quality is really intense. And so I've found for myself that I need to work on releasing.
Yep.
So what you're describing is helpful for me.
Another technique that you can do is you can go to the observer position when when they're having those moments.
Yeah.
In other words, you're standing on the sideline looking at yourself.
Yeah.
It'll pull layers of emotions out that way, but make sure you reassociate, because you don't want to be floating over there.
Yeah, right.
But yeah,
And
I love those grief responses, because it's a cathartic response. I've felt
yes.
them. It's
Yes.
very and I'll tell people when the session comes to a close, I said, look, if you feel the urge to cry, that's normal. That's a biological response. Your body's going to purge all that stuff you've been holding for such a long period of
Right.
time.
That's right.
Dump it out, because you'll feel another 100 pounds lighter.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. The grief response is real, and I love that you're normalizing it, because that's what I've been trying to do for people. Like, you went through some really bad stuff. It is normal for you to grieve it.
yes,
It is normal for you to grieve it. And it's not the case that the work that you're doing and the protocol removes all of our emotions,
no,
right? We can't do that. And it's not healthy to do that.
right.
It's just removing the connection with the trauma response.
Yeah, it's basically removing the emotion from that specific event that changes your patterns of behavior moving forward, because there's a part of your brain called the hippocampus, and that's where all of your emotions sit, right? So like anger, sadness, grief, it's there for future use. This is never going to remove anybody's ability to feel emotions, because, well, one, that's not healthy. There are
Right.
times in our lives where we should feel sad, right?
Absolutely.
We lose somebody that's close to us. Sadness is normal. That's
Right.
that's the value that we put on those people. We need to go through that. We need to go through a normal grief response. But if 2 years down the road you're still a 9 or 10 on that grief response, that's trauma, and that's unhealthy. And what we'll do is help you sever those emotional reactions, so that then you can actually heal it appropriately, and the brain can then reconsolidate those memories to where they need. Basically, you're refiling those moments into different filing cabinets of the brain.
Yeah, that's really, really, helpful for folks to think about the difference between the normal grief response and then when it becomes actually associated as a trauma response, right?
Correct. Yep.
And I think kind of sadness works the same way. Like, we get sad about things, but there's a moment where it becomes depression.
Right. Yeah, sadness will develop into patterns that becomes, and maybe sadness connects to grief, maybe it connects to
Right.
isolation and loneliness, and then you're depressed, and what we reject gets our energy. So, if it's a sadness response that you had at the age of 7, and maybe you've been on medication for 30 years, right? You're not feeling yourself, because your brain chemistry gets so screwed up because of the medications. When you go back to those root injuries, and I always refer to the moments as an injury, because it's not an illness, right? You're not broken. It's just an injury, right? Something happened, you were injured, and you got stuck in an emotional state that didn't create positive, resourceful outcomes for you. And then those patterns of behavior grew into that depression. So when you go back to those roots, and that's the key, finding the roots where they started, which is why we always take them back to the earliest memory that they can recall. Activate that emotion. When the emotion's active, it's malleable. And all we do is frame those events in a way that makes sense to the unconscious brain, and it releases the emotion attached to that specific memory. And I always refer to the brain kind of to as a computer. So it's almost like you're patching software. You're going back to that 7-year-old that experienced sadness or loss, and you're reframing it with their adult understanding, and then the brain releases the emotion that's attached to that memory because it finally made sense, right?
Yeah.
The human brain has to make sense out of every data point that comes into it, right? We have what we call open loops. If the loops are open, like if you don't close a loop to make sense for somebody, they're going to look for information in their own brain based on their own experiences to fill that loop, to close that loop. And oftentimes a 7-year-old doesn't know how to appropriately process. So it's filling information in like, it's my fault. I did something wrong. I was a bad child. And that wasn't an accurate representation. It's out of context. And they got stuck with that depression or that sadness that just kind of kept looping through their lives. So when you go back and you open those loops back up, all we're doing was putting new information in there. And that new information, the brain's like, oh, that makes so much sense. It wasn't my fault. My mom did the best she could, or hurting people hurt, whatever that would, adding the empathy to that moment. And then the emotions go away, and then they respond differently when those triggers pop up in the future. The triggers won't activate the emotion, it'll activate the information. And then you'll react based on the information versus the feelings that you used to have. It's pretty remarkable actually that we actually have the capacity to do that.
Yeah, it's amazing. The brain and how we can heal it and how we process things it's absolutely amazing and shocking in some ways, right? Like that you could take something that someone's been suffering from for 20 plus years and in a few hours work them through it, and they're kind of relieved of all of that they've held for so long. Like it's actually hard, I think, to believe it.
Well, and that's one of the things that sounds a little bit too good to be true, right?
Exactly.
And that's one of the probably why it's taken 6 years for us to really kind of get this more accepted, and we're still not mainstream,
Right.
right? The academic world is starting to look at some data points. There's going to be some studies that are going to come out that'll cause the peer review literature to happen, and I'm going to be doing a study with another nonprofit where we're going to do brain mapping pre and post treatment, and that veteran organization does neurofeedback. So we'll probably have a neurofeedback group where they'll do like 20 sessions of neurofeedback, and then probably like 5 sessions of the peer rescue protocol, and then do follow-up brain mapping to see the results. And then Dr. Hagedorn hopefully can publish that with an IRB, and that's objective data, that's not subjective data. And then that's going to be the scientific catalyst to let those people in that world know. Because the reality is, like 220, and then we have a new nonprofit called Healing the Hero. They're peer support organizations, right? The reason we had to go peer support is we couldn't get the buy-in from the mental health world. We thought they were going to become our biggest allies, and I know now it's like you got a jabroni like me with no mental health background coming in. It's like, we can heal PTSD, depression, and anxiety, and they're looking at me like I got something growing out of the middle of my forehead. I get that. I understand. The way our education system works, it's very structured. It's the box. They don't like to go outside of the box. What they say, the candlestick maker was never going to make the light bulb, right? So, we're kind of disrupting, but not. I think a lot of therapists look at it from a wrong direction, right? There are so many people with trauma. Like in the United States, I think that's the average is diagnosed 9 to 11 million with PTSD at any given time. That's just diagnosed, right? That's not, it's probably 2 to 3 times that are undiagnosed, right? And then anxiety, it's like, was it 21% of adults in the US are clinically diagnosed with anxiety, right? There is no shortage of clientele. Like, we've got therapists that this is their primary method of healing people, and they're the most relevant in their networks, right? I got guy Charlie Burkhart. He's up there in Pennsylvania. I think he's outside of Philadelphia, and he reaches out probably once every couple of months to share stories, and I love it. And he's a Vietnam veteran, so he's in his 70s. He's a retired police officer, so he works with a lot of that community. And he says he's the only one in his practice that's using the TRP and the EMP because he's the only one doing trauma work because he's so good at it. That's our hope. Our hope is that if we can get more buy-in from the mental health world, we'll be able to heal more people because PTSD, I mean, we even get vets that say the VA can't see him for 4 months. And they're like, I don't even know if I'm going to be here in 4 months. And there's people in the civilian world, it's the same way. And here I got a news flash for your audience. Veterans and first responders do not hold the patent to trauma. Okay. Most of us, cops, firemen, vets, all started childhood trauma. Like my worst traumatic stuff was when I was 4 and 11, right? Never put a uniform on, right? I actually went into, those fields because of it, and the same thing you see in the mental health world. A lot of them go into that field, because they want to help people or try to figure out how to help themselves. So, just because you never wore a uniform and never went to combat, don't discount the level of your traumatic stress, because I tell civilians all the time, if I stepped on the pressure plate and I detonated an IED 10 feet away and my stress level goes to an 8 and you were in a car crash and somebody died and yours goes to a 10, well, guess what? Yours is subjectively worse than mine. So, I mean, yeah, we may have seen and had to do some bad things in combat, but it's don't sell yourself short just because you didn't serve in a uniform. Your trauma is just as valid as anybody else's, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise.
Yeah, the world is a rough place for all of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is. And the statistics that you're mentioning are like amazing. Like I didn't know that the diagnosed PTSD was between 9 and 11 million. That's
Yeah,
a little boggling, right? It's boggling to the mind.
And in the veteran community, there's about 1 million of them. So the veterans have a higher propensity or higher likelihood of being diagnosed.
Right.
But I think that's because they're going to places like the VA to try to get help.
Mm-hmm.
So many people, we've stigmatized mental health to the point where people just don't want to go seek treatment because they don't want to be that person, right? They don't want to think that there's something wrong with them when there really isn't. It's just you can't get through this life unscathed.
Right, exactly. And I think the other thing that we come up against in the communities that we work with, one, there's stigma, but two, there's access issues. Correct. So there aren't enough therapists that know how to work with trauma. Exactly. And depending on your insurance, if you are a low income person in a community that doesn't have therapists locally, then how do you even get there? Because therapists, at least in Pennsylvania, they can't bill insurance if they go to you. You have to come to the therapist and it has to be on their location, right? So a little bit of that led up during the pandemic with the virtual, but yeah, like if you're really low income, you may not even have a computer connection, right? And so there's a big access issue there, which is why I really love the approach that you're taking now, like working through community-based organizations like churches, to try to train those people that are in the communities working with folks already providing pastoral care. Correct. Right. This is a natural next step for folks to be able to support people in communities. So I really think that that's an amazing thing that you're doing with that work.
Well, the beauty is the interventions are non-clinical in nature, right? We don't discuss, we don't allow them to talk about, we don't give them advice or counsel. This isn't cognitive there. This is the focusing on the trigger and releasing the trigger. So when we're able to work in a church community, like Healing the Hero is going to be a faith-based ministry, right? Where we want to actually get Healing the Hero into churches where we can come in and train people local to that church community. But they can also bring in, at the same time we do the training, grief share. All right, celebrate recovery, all of the addiction stuff, prison ministry teams. Think about the hurting people go to churches, right? It's a hospital for emotionally hurt people, and it's a place for normal people to go to. Not saying that we're not normal, it's just that we're looking for something. But for us to be able to train a church team, ministry team, it's like, well, you're eliminating the access problem, right? And that's the beauty of it is, whether we're training a church or another nonprofit, right? When you're talking access, 99% of the work we do is remote, right? We're never in the same facility with somebody unless we're training, or for me, if under the Tactical Resiliency USA, they bring us out to work with a police department or a fire department. We're typically never in the same geographic location, and the work doesn't have to even be done on a computer. I've done many sessions with a cell phone, right? I've even done sessions, with text messaging, getting them to release emotions over a text message, because all I got to do is get them to feel the emotion. I got to get them to disassociate, reframe, and release, right? So I can do that in many different ways. So that's the really cool part is if you're in an inner city community and you don't have the financial resources, or maybe you're on Medicaid and Medicaid doesn't cover a lot. Well, if you're going to a nonprofit, well, guess what? They're not charging you for services. You just go get help, right? And that's the big goal and that's why it's so cool to work with the ministries, the pastoral care and the ministry teams. It's like, hey, go forth and heal, right? I don't have to be the one creating or leading that charge on healing. I can train you. I could give you a fish you'll eat for a day, or I can teach you to fish and you'll eat for a lifetime. That's really the goal that we're looking for. How do we train more people to do what we do so that they can go out and help their communities flourish? Because everybody deserves to be happy.
I love that. I really love that. And especially, when we talk about communities that are experiencing a lot of community violence, like there we see that cyclical nature of trauma, right? And to break that cycle where people, and this again speaks to the stigma of receiving care and healing, if that could be done in the community that they're already in with people that they already trust, like that's really giving me inspiration that we can kind of really do some interruption of violence
Absolutely.
on the streets and in our communities with this.
It goes back to trauma, right?
Exactly.
If
That's
kids
it.
are raised in traumatic environments, it's kind of like, me from a law enforcement perspective, we would deal with a lot of juvenile delinquency. It's not their kid's fault. You can look at mom or dad and you'll see why that child has developed those patterns of behavior, or maybe they were exposed to something super traumatic and they don't have full access to logic brain all the time, and they're not able to focus in school, and maybe their grades aren't as good because their brain's wandering into their trauma world all the time, and then they're looking for that family connection because maybe they're not getting it at home, and maybe they join a gang, right? Because they're looking for some kind of family connection, so but the youngest we've worked with on the trauma side is 4. I mean, think about that. Imagine if you could interrupt a trauma response of a 4 or 5-year-old. What would that look like for their life 20 years down the road? Huge difference.
Yeah, that's amazing. Amazing work. Well, I've been asking everyone that's joined the podcast if there's a resource that you would like to share with our listeners. Do you have a favorite resource about mindfulness? I mean, you did mention Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps Score, which is a great book. But is there anything else if folks are either looking for a practice or interested in exploring the topic that you want to mention?
Well, I think education is paramount. I think we should be lifelong learners. So I love the Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps Score, for that reason, because, we see so many health ailments in the world, but specific resources, I don't really have one other than, find somebody in your community that you can connect with and that you can actually, maybe have some local resources. Like you guys are great in Pittsburgh, the Awaken Pittsburgh. It was so fun to go up there and train social workers and therapists and cops and firefighters all in the same group. So I wish I had something more. I'm pretty much stuck in this world
You're good.
of PTS. So your veterans out there, if you're looking for help, healingthehero.org is a new one, or 220.org. Sessions are free for you and your family, and you don't ever have to discuss trauma.
Yeah, that's great. Is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you want to share? Anything on your mind that I didn't ask about?
Well, the mindfulness practice that you use, okay? So how would somebody get a hold of that?
So Awaken Pittsburgh, we do a whole variety of mindfulness practices, right? And in fact, I tried to hook you into one of our courses, which you still have to do.
I know I will.
But we really take the approach that everybody is unique and everybody has a different need. And so there's not just a one size fits all approach that we take because, for example, you are a person of faith, and so your prayer practice has entered into your meditation or vice versa, right?
Correct.
For other people, that's not going to work.
Right.
You also mentioned breath work. And I know that there's research out there that says about 50% of people can't use their breath as an anchor for whatever reason. Maybe trauma, right? Maybe they had asthma as a kid and it just becomes a trauma trigger for them, or for whatever other reason, who knows, right? But breath is not always a focus. So we really work, the way that we frame our programming, I should say, is we work to provide a smorgasbord for people to experiment and then land on the thing that's going to be the most supportive for them. And for me, as personally, my practice changes every day. So like I check in with myself and I say, what's there? What do I need to be working on? What am I holding? You know, for example, if it's a day where I'm feeling a lot of joy, I might really sit with my joy and amplify it and really kind of ride that wave. And if it's a day that I'm feeling grief, then I might do another practice to work with that, you know, a compassion practice or something like that. So I really believe that each moment, like we should be checking in with ourselves and seeing what we need and doing the practices that work with whatever's arising in the present moment. Yeah.
Absolutely. I love it.
That's kind of where I'm at. No easy answer there. Sorry, folks.
I would say another resource, and I don't know if your audience even knows who this guy is, but there's a guy named Wim Hof, right?
Okay.
Wim Hof is nicknamed the Iceman, right? He's in his 60s. He's got videos all over YouTube. He's so big into breath work, like breath work for trauma, breath work for everything, but he also does the ice baths. I don't know if you've ever done an ice bath, right? I've done a few in my day. They're painful, but I'll tell you what, you will feel amazing for 4 to 6 hours after. I love doing ice baths.
I will just admit to the world here and now, I have been resistant to the ice bath.
Well, it shuts down your body's inflammation. So,
Okay.
you know, when you've been beat up and banged up as much as I have, you know, in combat and in law enforcement, it felt amazing. I mean, the 2 minutes I was shivering in places I didn't know could shake, but afterwards it was like, oh, man, this feels really good for about 4 to 6 hours. So if you can stand 2 minutes of cold water immersion or even just a cold shower running down the back of your neck, you'll shut down your vagus nerve. You'll shut off any kind of emotional reactions, you know. But look into Wim Hof, the Iceman. He's a super cool guy. That's a good resource for your people.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dan. It's been such a pleasure to reconnect with you after a few months here and just to talk.
Well, Stephanie, keep sharing the stories and the big wins on the clients you've worked with, because that's really what lights me up. It drives me and motivates me to keep going. And you know, your community deserves to heal.
Yeah. And I guess then just to mention this resource that Dan has trained about 15 folks here in Pittsburgh. And so if anyone's listening, you can get in touch with me and I can help you find someone to run the trauma resilience protocol here in Pittsburgh with you. Because we have a cohort, and myself included, that are just willing and able to work with people to help them heal their trauma.
We need to come up and do another training because that was fun.
Yeah, we need to do it again. So foundations listening, if you're interested in funding another training, we're interested in writing that grant.
Absolutely. It's so much, the trainings are so much fun because you got to heal in the training.
Yeah.
You know, and you see rapid transformations of people that are in the training, and then you start seeing how you exponentially can start changing and affecting your own local community. Like, you know, I firmly believe if we could get the whole world to go through this, we could actually come off of a war footing. Right?
Yes.
You know, and just imagine, I mean, we're going to be training, hopefully, a psychiatrist in the Ukraine here pretty soon.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So
that's amazing.
That's a partnership with the other nonprofit in America. They're doing work in the Ukraine. And I said, well, if you have that person, send him to me. And as long as he's got a good concept of English, and then he can just translate the work into Ukrainian, and then let's train more people in the Ukraine, whether they're churches or local NGOs or nonprofits, because that's a pretty messed up state right now.
Thank you so much for all the work you're doing. It makes my heart happy.
Mine too. That makes two of us.
Say Something Studios.